Welcome to the Stories Told podcast. This is episode 77, Seeing the Trees for the Forest. This is the Stories Told podcast. Two authors talking about stories in movies, TV, and of course, books.
I'm Michael Grayford. I write action-adventure stories in fantasy and sci-fi worlds, sometimes for younger readers and sometimes for adults. And I try to always inject at least a little bit of humor.
And I am author E.W. Barnes, and I write action-adventure, time travel novels, and space opera science fiction. Thousands of years, thousands of worlds. But be forewarned, beyond here, there will be spoilers. Are you ready for the adventure? Let's begin. Welcome back to the Stories Told podcast. I'm author E.W. Barnes, and with me is author Michael Grayford. And today we're talking about the story told in the novel The Green and the Gray by Timothy Zahn. How you doing today, Mike?
I am doing great, thank you. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. And what's new in your writing world?
Oh boy, new in my writing world. I was hoping to have beta draft done by this time. Still working on it. I'm probably 95% of the way through, but there's still a lot of stuff that has to be done. The last few chapters need a lot of finessing. And then there's also notes that ripple backward through the manuscript. Like, this needs to be set up more. I need to flesh this stuff out. So I still got to go back again and add some more things. So it's progressing. I did quite a bit, but it's not quite there yet. And how are things going with your writing?
I am now 18% into the writing of Meridian, and I have gone through and cleaned up a lot of stuff, so the chapters are now pretty clean. I'm
Excellent.
Fairly happy with it, and things are moving forward in a way that I'm comfortable with. So yeah, all is well there. Excited. I don't know if I'm going to be able to. I've got a sort of tentative deadline for myself to have this whole series finished by the end of the year. I don't know if I'm going to be able to do that, at the pace I'm going, but at least I'm satisfied with the fact that I'm continuing to steadily work on the book, even though it's going more slowly than I had hoped. But slow and steady is better than nothing at all. So there we are.
Yeah, exactly. So how do you know how far percentage-wise you are into your book? Are you basing off of a expected word count at the end?
Yes. So I have a sort of a word count goal I give myself. I have a word count goal of 75,000 words, which is actually kind of short for sci-fi. But I don't spend a lot of time describing technology, and I don't spend a lot of time describing exotic planets, which a lot of people really like, and that's great. I tend to keep things a little bit more character focused and action focused, with the technology and the scenery as a supplement. But for some people, one of the reasons they read science fiction is because they love the futuristic technology and the exotic planets. And so there's, that's perfectly great for those kinds of readers. My reading is a little bit more streamlined. Not to say that books that have that aren't. I'm just saying that I don't usually include that much. So I aim for 75,000. The last book, I actually exceeded that, went over 80. That's just sort of a general target. So when I say that percentage, that's based on that target. It may be more.
Yeah, like roughly that much. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And as a reminder to our listeners, you can read The Adventures of the Empyrean Guard, which is my space opera science fiction series. That's available in draft on Patreon at the Galactic Heroes level. And you can also read The Tales of Zara, which book 2 is what he's working on right now as he's cleaning up that draft. And that book 1 is available on Amazon in both episodic format on Kindle Vella, and the links to all of those stories are in the show notes. So what interesting stories have you come across lately in books or movies or television?
Let's see, I've only been reading. So the book we're going to be discussing today, I haven't been watching any shows really in the last week, other than catching a tad bit of the Olympics. That's about it. Yeah, so just this book. Nothing super exciting, unfortunately. What have you been reading or watching?
Also been reading this book, Though I will say that, Timothy Zahn is a very well-known author. He's a Nebula Award winner, I think, or a Hugo Award winner. I forget which. And he wrote a series of books that take place in the Star Wars universe after the fall of the Empire. And the first book in that series is called Heir of the Empire, or To the Empire. And I was so pleased to be reading another Timothy Zahn novel in The Green and the Gray that after I finished The Green and the Gray, I picked up Heir to the Empire and started reading that again.
Oh, cool.
And the only thing I've been watching is actually old reruns of Northern Exposure. That's a series that came out in the 90s, I think. Did you ever see that?
I don't think so, no.
It's a cute little series. It's a story about a doctor who graduates from medical school, and his medical school expenses were paid for by the state of Alaska. So to return the commitment that he made to the state of Alaska, he has to practice medicine in Alaska. And when he arrives in Alaska, instead of going into Anchorage as he thought he was going to, he's sent to this little town of 800 people. And so this Manhattanite has to figure out how to function in a small town with all the small town quirks. It's very sweet. It's very light yet charming show with a little bit of, I want to say, metaphysicality to it. It doesn't always stay in reality, which is kind of in a fun way. It's a very kind of light thing. So
it's like a cozy medical story?
Well, except that it's not really about the medicine. It's more about the town.
Okay.
The medicine is almost, it provides a framework for the stories, but it's not really about that. Yeah, and when I say metaphysical, is sometimes, we've only just in the first season watching this, and I think it ran for 6 seasons. But there is an episode where one of the characters who is incredibly into movies and wants to write his own screenplay constantly puts the other characters, his fellow townspeople, into scenes from his favorite movies. And it's hilarious because, of course, the movies you recognize, right? So it's really fun. So all of a sudden you have these characters acting out these scenes from very famous movies as Ed is trying to figure out what to write in his own screenplay. So it's just really cute. It's kind of light. It is cozy, but it's more about the people in the town than it is the doctor himself.
Yeah, it's a good setup for a story. I like that.
Yeah. So are you ready to talk about The Green and the Gray?
Yeah, let's go.
Today we're talking about the story told in the novel The Green and the Gray by Timothy Zahn, and I'm going to read the synopsis on the back of the paperback book. Strangers Among Us. For years, the Greens and the Grays have lived quietly among us in the shadows of New York, alien refugees from a war of attrition that utterly destroyed the rest of their kind. Passing as everyday citizens, each group has long believed that they are all that remain of their old world and their terrible conflict. But now, to their mutual surprise, they have found each other, and the old hatreds and fears have once again risen to the surface. On a cold October night, Roger and Caroline Whittier are accosted at gunpoint, and an unexpected burden is thrust upon them, Melantha Green, a 12-year-old girl snatched from the hands of a peace coalition consisting of both Greens and Grays. The coalition had been preparing to cold-bloodedly sacrifice her in a last-ditch effort to prevent the impending battle, and it desperately wants her back. As Roger and Caroline strive to protect Melantha, they enlist the aid of an NYPD detective and a former Ellis Island clerk. These unlikely allies have just 1 week to find a way to prevent New York City from becoming a battlefield for a surpassingly strange gang war, likes of which the world has never known. Did you like this story?
Yeah, I do like this story. I read a lot of Timothy Zahn's work, including the ones that you mentioned, the Heir to the Empire trilogy and his other Star Wars books. That's actually how I was introduced to him as an author. I was reading those and I liked those, and then I read, I don't know what next book I read of his, but I've since read most of them. This one's interesting because it's one of the very few that takes place in sort of modern day Earth. Most of his sci-fi is in space or on other planets or on spaceships, things like that. So it's kind of neat to see one that's a little bit more real worldy with science fiction elements thrown into it. So it's kind of an interesting, easy introduction maybe into the world of Timothy Zahn. If you're not like a huge science fiction reader, kind of it touches on it and then you get more of it as you go along through the story. I like that it starts off quickly. It sets up the conflict of the story and mystery of the story very fast within the first chapter. I mean, not counting the prologue, which kind of sets it up. But within the first chapter, it sets it up. Now, you don't necessarily have the context for what that conflict is, but it throws it out there and it gets you into the story very quickly. It sets up the mystery very quickly. And I think Zahn, a lot of his stories are sort of science fiction mystery, which is kind of how this reads to me. Has a very mystery feel to it, right? You're constantly wondering what's going on, what the people are doing, what's this conflict about. And he does, I think, a good job of giving you answers as the story goes along, while simultaneously leaving a lot of things open and also opening new mysteries as it goes. So it takes a while to really figure out what's happening at the end. I won't talk too much about where it ultimately goes because, kind of spoil what happens, what the reveals are. So I'll try to talk a little bit more generally, at least through maybe half the book. But I like that when you find something out, there's still more to reveal. I think that's a good technique. And I think something else that I like with Zahn is that he does a good job of presenting characters who are smart, and we get to see them figuring things out. I generally dislike the opposite type of story, where characters are not that smart and the story relies on them being that way. You see that in a lot of horror movies, for example. The people are in these situations because they're just dumb. They just make poor decisions throughout. They don't really have a capacity to figure things out. So that's one of the reasons I like Timothy Zahn books in general, is because he tends to portray characters who are smart, who are always thinking, who are always trying to figure out what's going on, who are invested in the mystery, and that makes us as the reader invested in it along with them. So I really like that aspect of it. And then I like how he brings different pieces together toward the end. There's a lot of moving parts in this story, and those moving parts are in the form of different characters and different factions that are set up. There's a lot to keep track of. I think it would be hard to read this book every so often and try to remember what was happening. So I read it through pretty quickly, and I think that helped. Kind of keep it all in your head and remember which character is which. But I like the way that he sets things up. I like the way that he pays things off. It's not so much a character development story in terms of the protagonists you're following along with, but that's kind of typical of a mystery, of both mystery stories and a lot of science fiction stories. Often they're not so much character stories as they are idea stories. And that tends to be, again, another hallmark of Timothy Zahn's writing, at least his general science fiction stories. So you have to kind of go into it with that knowledge that this isn't going to be like a more character-driven fantasy type story. So given that, yeah, I think he does it. I think he does it very well. I think he sets out the mysteries and then pays them off over the course of the story without just dumping it all onto you at the end as a sort of shock. He reveals things, and he also gives you updates on things along the way so that you don't feel like you're constantly wondering what's going on. There are explanations given over the course of the story that at least satisfy a little bit, like, oh, okay, that's what that thing meant, or that's what that character was doing. So I like that. I like that more than just, I don't know what's going on until the end when it all gets dumped on me. So anyway, yeah, overall, I like the story. I think it's a light introduction into science fiction and Timothy Zahn. But what are your thoughts? What do you like about this story?
Some very similar notes. It was really clear that this story was incredibly well thought out because, as you said, there's a lot of moving parts. And to tie them all together satisfactorily requires a great deal of thought and sort of mapping things out and making sure you don't lose track of all your threads. And I was very impressed by that. And I agree with you. I appreciate characters who are smart when they're evaluating the clues presented to them and the information that they have to try to solve the mystery as you're reading along trying to solve the mystery yourself. There was one moment where I think that failed. Other than that, I thought that, these characters were pretty smart in what they were trying to do. I also enjoyed it. It was a very clean, very easy read. It starts off a little scary, with the attempted murder of a 12-year-old. So that's kind of a little disturbing. That's the last moment of that kind of behavior in the story. So that's in the prologue, and that's it. And the rest of the story is very clean. It's not scary. There's some suspenseful moments and definitely, where you're kind of wondering what's going to happen, but it's not anything that makes you go, oh my gosh, is something terrible going to happen? So I really appreciated that because that's the kind of story I really enjoy. I don't want to be shocked. And I thought that it was very well done in the way the mystery was maintained throughout the story. You got new pieces of information that seemed to answer old questions, but then you had new questions and things moved along, that way as a mystery should. So again, I was very impressed with the level of thought that went into crafting a story with this many moving parts. So yeah, very similar to what you had to say. Is there anything that you might have changed as a writer?
There was a few things that came to mind. I felt like in the early half of the book, maybe, it felt like the Whittiers, right, the primary protagonists that we're following around, get bounced around a lot in the early half of the book. They kind of like, okay, now they got taken by this group, and they're having a little discussion over there, and then they get taken by this group, and they're having this discussion over there. It was really hard to keep track of that. As you're reading it, it felt like this sort of haphazard series of events. It all makes sense later, and you see like, okay, I see why this setup was there. But I feel like some of that maybe could have been either trimmed or condensed, tightened up a little bit, because it was a lot to keep track of. And then I also would have liked to have seen some more falling action and resolution at the very end. This is something we've mentioned before with other stories and movies, or sometimes it's like, okay, the climax is there and we're done, and then that's it. This one had a little bit of falling action and resolution, but I don't know. I kind of wanted a little bit more, just to see maybe this character is a little in their normal worlds just a little bit longer. It's definitely there. Most of the characters that we're following along with, we get a sense of that. And to be fair, some of it may be because I was racing to finish the story before the podcast. I just barely wrapped it up before we started. So I might have even been doing some, unconscious skimming there toward the end. So maybe that was just a me thing. But it felt like I wanted a little bit more at the end. And overall, some trimming to various points throughout the story. I'm not even sure specifically what it would be. It felt like it went on a long time, given like the amount of time that actually passed in the story. But that's it. Pretty small things overall. I enjoyed it, and I enjoyed the flow of the story. What about you? What aspects of it would you improve?
Well, two things kind of stood out for me, and one of them you actually alluded to, which was sort of the action. There wasn't much except the moving around, going from one place to the next place to the next place. There was a lot of moving around. But what kind of threw me off, and this may be just a personal preference as a reader, and other people may not mind this that much, but to me, there was an awful lot of talking and not much happening. There just wasn't as much action as there was talking. And I think I would have liked to have had a little bit more of a balance between the action and the talking. The other thing that kind of stood out for me was that, we start the story with Melantha, and we're connected to her, and we're invested in what happens to her. And she disappears very early on in the story. And we spend a lot of the story not with her. And I think we should have stuck with her.
I had the same thought. I forgot to write that down, but I definitely felt the same thing. Like, because you're kind of invested in her, right? That's where the prologue is. And it's like, here's this girl who's in danger. And she's sort of torn between these competing sides. And you feel like she's almost been brainwashed in a way to believe a certain thing. And then she's gone. And, they're trying to figure out where she is and get her back. But she's just out of the story pretty much until the end.
Yeah. And so I found that very frustrating because I wanted to, I think it would have been helpful to stay with her. And since the prologue establishes her as a voice, I mean, the rest of the book is essentially told from the Whittier's perspective. You either are in Roger's eyes or you're in Caroline's eyes, but you start with her, with Melantha. And so I think that it would have been okay to stay with her and add that perspective too. And I don't think it would have thrown off the storytelling too much, but it would have given us that ongoing connection with her. Anyway, that's just a thought that I had about it. That I think I would have liked to have.
Because of the type of story, because it is sort of a mystery story. I mean, that's kind of how most of the Zahn stories go. I see why he did it the way he did. Is like, you don't know where she is, but it does feel like it's missing that. Like I feel like that's one of the personal connections that we have to the story, right? Outside of that, it's a bit more intellectual.
Yes.
Right? Like you said, there's a lot of dialogue and a lot of thinking about what they're going to do. And she was sort of that heart that attaches you to the story, and then that kind of disappeared for a while. So I agree with that.
Intellectual is a great way to frame it. I agree. So did you derive any themes from The Green and the Gray?
Oh, let's see. The themes. I mean, this is a twofold genre. It's like a genre mixed story, right? It's a mystery story and a science fiction story. And often mystery stories tend to not necessarily have a greater theme other than crime doesn't pay. If there's, it's we're catching the criminal type of thing. This wasn't so much that, and it wasn't even so much the science fiction aspect of it, right? There was an interesting idea there of who these different groups were, where they came from, how they can live in the story. And I think or how they can live in this world. I think that ultimately is where the theme goes, which is the idea of you have to put aside past grievances to be able to move forward and live a happy life. Something like that. I'm just kind of making this up right now as I'm talking. But it's I guess that's kind of where I'm left with at the end. Do you have a more concrete theme or better theme than that?
I picked up on that theme as well. And one of my notes is, give peace a chance.
Yeah.
But the other theme I pulled from that, which kind of dovetails with the give peace a chance, is the importance of trust. Because there was a little bit of character development here between Roger and Caroline understanding how each other thought and understanding how each other problem solved.
Right.
And at the end, there's this development of trust between the two of them, an appreciation of their different problem-solving skills, as well as the trust between the Greens and the Grays that result in peace, trust amongst the law enforcement officers trying to do their job with big holes in their understanding of what's going on. So I would say that to me would be an overarching kind of thing to look at, was the various different kinds of trust that played out here that resulted in, a positive ending.
Yeah, that's a great note. And I'm trying to dance around it without giving away the reveals at the end, but it's seeing things through another viewpoint, which kind of connects to that trust, right? It's like, okay, there's this other group or this other person who doesn't think like I do, but that doesn't necessarily mean I should throw nefarious intentions on them in the case of the Greens and the Grays. And we do get some of that, you're right, with Carolyn and Roger. It's sort of mentioned in the beginning, right? When he's like, why are you assuming that I'm mad at you kind of thing, right? There's this like acceptance of the other person without applying any kind of judgment to them. So I think that's great. You're right. That's definitely part of the theme. Good catch.
Thank you. What are your takeaways as a writer?
Oh man. I think for me the most impressive thing is, like you said before, sort of the juggling act of keeping all these different elements together and weaving them into a story that can be followed, because there's so many different pieces, right? So many moving parts. It's hard to keep track of. So I think if you're doing something like this, probably, I mean, I don't know Timothy Zahn's process, but I'm guessing he plotted this thing out pretty significantly before tackling it. It would have been a nightmare to try to unravel if he had just started writing this as a discovery writer, but maybe I'm wrong. So I think planning it out, if it's a mystery, certainly if it's this complex, what would be your takeaway?
My takeaway would be what we were talking about with Melantha, and that is staying with the sympathetic character, keeping that character in the story to keep the reader engaged with the character that they have connected with. As you very well put it, the character that brings the heart to the story.
Yeah, I suspect that probably neither he nor the editor recognized that, because she was, if you're plotting this out, it's like she was a mechanism for propelling the story rather than seen as like, this is a character that we're going to attach to.
Yeah.
Because that's how it reads. But when you're reading it, she is the character that you attach to. So I think that was maybe a misstep. So good takeaway.
Thank you for joining us as we talked about the story told in the novel The Green and the Gray by Timothy Zahn. A big thank you to our Patreon supporters and all our subscribers. We're so grateful for your support and your encouragement. The Stories Told podcast is available on multiple podcast platforms, and we thank you for liking and subscribing or following, depending on where you're listening. It may not be a big deal to you, but it means a lot to us. If you have a favorite book, movie, or TV series you'd like to suggest for the podcast, leave a comment on the YouTube channel, and that link is in the show notes. You can find Michael Grayford at michaelgrayford.com and E.W. Barnes at 1000years.com, and those links are also in the show notes. Join us next time as we talk about the story told in the movie Elemental. Thanks so much, Mike. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, this was great. Thanks.
And we'll see you next time on the Stories Told podcast.